Hi, and welcome to Innovation Celebration, the show where we celebrate recent advancements in science and technology, the people and ideas that make them possible, and how they impact human flourishing. I'm Angelica Worth.
And I'm Thomas Walker, and I wanted to start by talking about a story that I think is being somewhat misrepresented in the popular media coverage.
What media never does that.
Yeah, I mean, this is a common problem in the popular reporting of science, but in this particular case, I'm talking about the recent discovery by a team, I'm just going to read their names off here, led by Dan Wilkins and Roger Blandford, who were studying the corona around a black hole.
We think of corona these days as coronavirus, but it literally means crown. So in astronomy, it refers to a ring of light or like a crown or halo around an object.
Yeah, so the sun has a corona. The sun, of course, is a very bright object. So you'll often, when they're studying the sun's corona, they'll often black out the sun. Black holes are obviously not bright. In fact, the whole issue with black holes is that their gravity is so powerful that even light can't escape. So studying the corona is, the sort of the closest area around the black hole which you can get light from. However, this team, in studying it, in analysing the light coming from, or X-ray coming from the corona, X-rays are a form of light, actually discerned that the light they were seeing was not coming from that; it was coming from behind the black hole, and this is being hailed as a proof of Einstein's theory of general relativity, and all the news coverage is using the word "proved," which I think is problematic on a couple of levels. For one, this is far from the first time that a piece of evidence has seemingly corroborated the theory of relativity. That goes right back to when Einstein first formulated it. In 1915, he did an experiment involving the position of Mercury relative to the Sun. In 1918, he did an experiment involving how the Sun's light is distorted by the Moon during a total eclipse. And in both cases, the observations matched his theory, and then subsequently the very discovery of gravity, that would be Newton, the very discovery of black holes and of gravitational waves much more recently, which is where my mind was going there, and numerous other discoveries in between have all matched predictions that Einstein made using the theory of general relativity and special relativity before it, which is a simpler version essentially of the same theory. And that's one issue, is that this isn't the first time, nor will it be the last, but depending on what's discovered from here forward. The other issue is that you don't really prove a theory.
And certainly not with one piece of evidence.
No, and as I say, this is the latest in a long line, but nevertheless, this is an issue come up when you debate evolution with people and things like that. Like, the language is misaligned between how we use it popularly and how it's...
what it actually means.
Yeah. A theory is a model that you construct to understand a system. And I have a bit of an allegory here, which is that imagine if you had a jigsaw puzzle and some pieces are missing of the jigsaw. So the pieces you have are the evidence you have about the natural world.
The things we've observed.
Yeah, and there's an image on that puzzle and you want to know what the complete image is, but you've got a few pieces missing here or there. So you could sort of draw lines where something seems to end on that side and start again on this side, and you fill in the sort of jigsaw puzzle shaped, piece shaped gap. The more pieces you've got, the more accurately you can do that, and you could probably fairly accurately fill in some of the, if you just had one piece missing. If you've got 3 pieces and the rest of it's empty, you can have no idea, and you could draw something, but it's almost certainly going to be wrong. This is kind of what religion does with the origins of the world. Like, okay, we know there's a sun and there's some land, let's just make the rest up. And there's everything from that through to you've just got one piece missing. We'll guess at it, and
you'll probably be pretty close because you have most of the information.
But where I find this allegory helpful is that once you've drawn your picture of the missing bits, you have an idea of what you're looking for in the real world, and that's where theories come in useful. And so Einstein, when he created the theory of relativity, was trying to reconcile classical mechanics, Newtonian mechanics, our traditional understanding of physics from the 18th century, with electromagnetism, which had come along in the 19th century and didn't match up with it. So he was trying to address a problem in the physical world with observation that he was then theorizing to try and fill in the gaps and jump ahead. So it was not like in philosophy, some philosophers will just completely start from not really abstraction, but start from a priori thinking that's not in any way grounded in reality, and draw conclusions from that, and then not really refer back to reality at any point. Einstein was not quite doing that. He was abstracting, but about the real universe, and then subsequently testing against the real universe. The point is that process never proves a theory. A theory remains a model for understanding reality. All it does, well, not all it does, but what it does is it gives you an idea of what evidence to look for in order to inform your understanding of reality. So we shouldn't take the theory of relativity as fact, no matter how many times it's corroborated by something. All that tells us is it gave us an idea of what to look for, and then that bore out reality.
And that it's a good theory, even if it later needs to be revised.
Yeah. And at some point, as happened with Newtonian physics, we'll probably find something that says, hang on, there's something wrong here.
Not quite, yeah.
But that hasn't happened yet. What has happened, though, is quantum mechanics has come along. And I don't honestly understand quantum mechanics. I have some knowledge about it, but I've never been able to wrap my head around it properly. I know there are some people who take issue with it in terms of some of the conclusions it makes, but there is an issue in physics at the moment that quantum mechanics and general relativity, i.e. the models we have for very small scales and larger scales, don't actually match up. They don't appear to belong to the same physics. And it seems unlikely that the universe operates on different physics on different scales.
Indeed.
That is almost far more likely to be an issue with the models we've come up with. So in the course of reconciling that, which many people are actively working on at the moment, it may be that the theory ends up getting revised. But the point is, observation comes first, and theories are. It's not that you come up with a theory and that's fact if things bear it out. It's you come up with a theory and you run with that as long as facts bear it out, and when facts stop bearing out, you have to make changes. So they're a useful tool for understanding what to look for. So that's the reason I kind of wanted to cover this, is to understand the metaphysical hierarchy there of the relationship between theory and observation. Did you want to jump in with something there?
No, I think you're covering everything we wanted to about theories. But did you want to talk a little bit just about this black hole they discovered?
So I'll have to look at my notes here quickly for a second just to get this again. Yes, so this is a black hole of 10 million solar masses. This is 10 million times as massive as the sun. So this is a supermassive black hole, to quote the Muse song, which
You beat me there.
these exist at the centres of large galaxies, and this particular one is 1.8 billion light years away. So it was actually referred to in one article I read as relatively close, but in galactic terms maybe, but this is still not even in our cluster of galaxies, let alone our local group. This is far away. Of course, with speed of light being what it is, this is also, we're seeing it 1.8 billion years ago, and what is
1.8 billion years later.
No, in the past. We're 1.8 billion years later. We're seeing it as it was 1.8 billion years in the past. And I had another note here, which is its name is I'm not sure if this is One's Wiki or I's Wiki. Either way, it's a strange name. But just to give you some information on the object in question in this instance, I think that's everything I wanted to cover. Yes.
I think so, yes. All right, so I'm going to move on to talk about an interesting area of medical innovation, which is broadly longevity studies, but we're going to focus in on a little bit on one specific area. So what longevity studies are is just that, most of us think of aging as inevitable. We're all going to get old. We're all going to most of us will get some Alzheimer's or cancer or something like that, which will eventually kill us. In the Western world, probably in your late 70s, 80s, somewhere in there. A little bit later if you're lucky. But most of us think of this as just part of life. But there's a group of entrepreneurs and doctors. In many cases, they're the same people. There are medical doctors who are also entrepreneurs who are trying to cure aging. And two such entrepreneurs and doctors are Peter Diamandis and Armando Cuesta. They're both, again, medical doctors and entrepreneurs. And the specific route that they've focused on recently, they've wrote an article about it. I'll link to it in the description. It's on Peter Diamandis' newsletter, which I highly recommend. There's some interesting stuff in there.
And I do want to give a shout out just to Peter Diamandis generally, because I'm a massive fan of his, and he was the originator of the X Prize, which advances
massive innovation.
These sorts of innovations encourages private businesses to,
and
with a financial reward, it's thanks to him that the Virgin Galactic launch happened, because it was the Google X Prize that made the first private spaceflight possible.
Yeah, so we do need entrepreneurs like that to spur some of these innovations.
And he's just, the king of that. He's really leading on that.
Yes. So would love to get him on the show sometime if we could.
Anyone who knows him, please put us in touch.
But anyway, so they explained in a recent article, these two, Diamandis and Cuesta, that when you age, in your blood you start to produce pro-inflammatory hormones, which are basically cytokines, which are molecules released by your immune system. In this case, it's your helper T cells that are releasing them. And they act as messaging signals, and they cause your immune system to essentially overwork itself. So then when it's hit with something big like cancer or Alzheimer's, it can't respond effectively. Okay. And that's when you succumb to those sorts of diseases.
This is an actually different problem from the problem of aging, as in the failure to replace cells, which is like the natural aging that causes our skin to wrinkle and things like that.
Right.
Because that's just interjecting here. Somebody else I'd really like to get on the show is Aubrey de Grey, another anti-aging researcher I'm very much into, and he sees that kind of aging as a disease in its own right, not something we should accept as part of life.
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of changes that happen as you age, and there are a number of great minds working in this area. But one solution to this problem with the pro-inflammatory hormones is called parabiosis. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how it's developed, but basically the concept is that you take a younger person or animal and use their blood or part of their blood to rejuvenate an older person or animal. And so this was, this appears in sci-fi, fantasy, all over the place.
This reminded me of an Alistair Reynolds book I read, and an episode of Babylon 5 jumps to mind as well, where young healthy people have their lives sapped to,
and even you think of
people.
Witches drinking the blood of young girls, but I promise there will be no need to abduct children. Okay, this was also mentioned in a Silicon Valley an HBO show called Silicon Valley, where a billionaire had a blood boy for this purpose. But again, no abducting children will be necessary. So in the real world, the first significant research on this area was published in 2005 by Irina and Michael Comboy. And what they did was they used mice, and they basically pooled the blood of a younger mouse and an older mouse, so that they were both had the same blood running in their system. And in a matter of about 5 weeks, the older mouse started to be rejuvenated. Specifically, their muscle and liver tissues were being repaired. Their skin and fur looked younger and healthier. But similarly, the younger mouse, the clock started to run forward, and they started to look older and more scraggly.
This is exactly what happens in the Babylon 5 episode. The healthy person is sapped to make the unhealthy person healthy, but then the other person gets the condition.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's what happens if you do it that way. Science has progressed past that, thankfully. So the next step was called therapeutic plasma exchange, or TPE. And that used donated plasma from young healthy people and didn't require the sapping of the younger person because donating plasma, if you haven't done it before, is not unlike donating blood. You sit down in a chair after they've done some health checks on you to make sure you're good to go. You sit down in a chair, they stick a needle in you, they pull your blood out, but then they don't just keep all the blood together, the whole blood it's called. They separate it. They just need plasma, which is the liquid part of your blood. It's usually like a straw or tan-colored liquid.
As opposed to the cells, red, white cells and platelets that make up most of the rest of it.
Precisely. Yeah. So they separate those two in a process called plasmapheresis, and then they take the red blood cells and the white blood cells and all of that, mix it with a saline solution and an anticoagulant so that you don't get blood clots, and give it back to you.
Right. So you're actually keeping the kind of functioning parts of your blood.
Which makes it a lot easier for your body to recover and to make more plasma and be back up to where it was before you donated. So, although it is a little bit easier in some ways than donating whole blood on your body, there are still some challenges, which, for example, you can have a bad reaction to it. I had a little bit of that the last time I donated plasma. because I'm very small and my veins roll. And so they had difficulty getting the needle in, which caused my blood to say like, no thank you, and clot up near where the needle was. And I ended up losing a couple of cups of blood.
Caused my blood to say like, no thank you.
Yeah. So that was not ideal. And fresh plasma is also really difficult to store and transport, and therefore very expensive.
Yeah, you need to keep it liquid.
Yeah, it has to stay at a certain temperature and things like that.
Yeah.
So the latest advancement in this area, parabiosis, is instead of using donated plasma from actual people, what if we could use proteins and substances that we can synthesize in a lab.
Much better.
Again, I promise, no abducting children.
Nobody's getting strapped up to a machine.
No. So they tested this in a study recently using a saline albumin immunoglobulin solution. So let me break that down real quick. Saline is just a solution with water and salts in it. Albumin is a protein made by your liver that exists in your blood. All mammals have it. Immunoglobulin is made by your immune system. So they combined these three into a solution. They gave it to, it was almost 500 people, it was like 490 something patients with Alzheimer's. And they found a 66% reduction in the progression of Alzheimer's in these patients. And they measured that using the standard for measuring the progression of Alzheimer's, which is a set of 23 daily activities that measure your physical and cognitive functioning. Things like washing the dishes, reading a book, right. Things that people need to do to go about their lives.
Yeah.
So that's the really good news, is it was, successful in that regard. But there are still some questions. That was a 3-part solution. So was one of those ingredients more important than the other?
Right.
Do you need all 3 things? And was it actually the solution that helped, or was it just the dilution of those pro-inflammatory hormones in your blood?
And this is always an issue with new medical treatments is, what aspect, moldy bread makes, disease get better.
What caused that? Yeah. Isolating the cause of these positive effects is definitely a regular challenge in these sorts of things. But still, that's still a huge advancement, and I think it's quite clear that the ramifications for human flourishing are enormous. If we can live longer and have a better quality of life at the end of our lives, that means that we can do the things we love and flourish for longer. Yeah. So. And
I also like to push back a bit against those people who say that, anti-aging is somehow bad because we'll, grow the population even more and run out of space or something like that. Firstly, my next item I'm going to talk about is about making those less habitable parts of the planet habitable. So, making the point that we do have a lot of space left to use up. But the other thing is that, firstly, there's the ocean and space to be colonized as well. Secondly, there's also, other things that people often worry about, like declining birth rates in Western countries.
Germany and Japan.
Germany and Japan notably, but it's more and more a problem, or it looks like it's going to become one, if populations start going into decline in certain areas. But these two dovetail nicely. If people are living longer at the same time, then that probably
keeps up the population.
Yeah, and hopefully I would like to see family planning rolled out. I make it sound like a policy,
not as a policy, not coercively, but
exactly.
Well, and you do see this in developing countries. They tend, as education and access to birth control increases, people generally choose to have smaller families.
Yeah, but there are, unfortunately, some big cultural barriers to that in some parts of the world. So it would be really good if extending lifespans and people only having children when they actually want to. And only having the number they actually want to went hand in hand. That would be a much happier world where people live a couple hundred years and they have one kid every now and again if they want to, and they don't if they don't.
Yeah.
And we all go about our lives the way we choose.
Indeed.
I think it would be a wonderful world to live in. So there's no way to me that this isn't a wonderful thing for human flourishing.
Well, and plenty of us have seen, on the negative side, Tom's just given us a lovely vision, but on the negative side, many of us have seen family members, suffer and die from cancer or Alzheimer's or something like that. So just not having to go through that pain would be already a huge improvement.
Exactly, yeah.
But I think that was a nice segue into our honorable mentions, so if you want to start us off.
Yes, so I wanted to talk about this is actually a government-run project, but I think the idea itself is really worth celebrating, and also it originated at a British university, so I'll give it that. But this is the government of Dubai. Dubai is, by the way, just so people understand, it's a federation, a bit like the United States.
The United Arab Emirates.
Sorry, yes. The United Arab Emirates is a federation, so Dubai is like one state within a 7-state federation. But yeah, it's an emirate. It's nothing like the US in terms of its structure, but its makeup is like that, or like Russia or any other federation you could name. But yeah, so this is the city and the surrounding area. But the government of the Emirate of Dubai is progressing a scheme to artificially make rain happen, and so the idea here is, basically the water table in Dubai is getting lower. It's harder and harder to get at drinking water and water for irrigation for agriculture. It's right next to the sea, but desalinating seawater is also extremely difficult
and expensive.
Yeah, so they're looking for ways to get more water into a place that only has 4 inches of rainwater in a typical year. And most of that's in the winter. In the summer, it's just too hot in this part of the world. Rain doesn't even stay as rain. It evaporates before it hits the ground if it starts in the first place. So, they're looking for ways to try and make human life more bearable in that part of the world. And they came up with 2 possible ways of doing it. One is to put silver iodide into the air. And then that's triggered the sort of predictable comments about chemicals in the air, and understandably they
right, that we don't know what the ramifications could be for safety.
Yeah, for health and or environmental impacts are a thing to take seriously, because they can thereby have an impact on health further down the line. You don't want to get stuff into the water supply that you don't want, or damage the ecosystem that you're depending on. But the other option, which is the one that the University of Reading initiated, is to use drones that then fire an electric charge in the air and encourage clouds to coalesce.
They should name these drones after one of those like gods of mythology, like Zeus or Thor, that produces lightning, because that's what it sounds like.
Yes, because when you imagine Zeus, you imagine a tiny little buzzing drone. But no, so yeah, the idea here is, and by the way, when we were concluding this, you imagined a farmer saying, "Oh, I can have a little rain cloud over my field."
Yeah, I thought you could just use it like for irrigation, but like in a cartoon where you have your own personal little rain cloud. But apparently not. It's a much larger scale than that.
I mean, I'm sure you could get a blimp to hover over your field and spray water on it, but
it's not as fun.
But no, this is to make it rain over a large area. And if you look at the link in the description, they've actually successfully caused pretty much a rainstorm to happen.
So it works. Yeah. And it works by making the clouds coalesce, right?
Yeah, so it incites natural rain, effectively. It's not like you're artificially spraying water or
right.
The chemical route. It's inciting a natural cloud to form. And as I said, I've already gone over why this is a positive thing, I think, but also Dubai has been doing the Las Vegas thing a lot. It is really the Vegas of the Middle East, where you're in the middle of the desert, but there's fountains and green spaces and all this stuff, and so it helps them create this livable, beautiful urban environment that they've managed to create there in this inhospitable setting.
An oasis in the desert.
Yeah, so it's hopefully a more sustainable, in the proper sense of the word, i.e. something you can keep doing, way of having that beautiful artificial environment that they've created in this extremely. It's worth remembering that nature is not some Garden of Eden that we walk into and mess up. It's an inhospitable, violent environment that we can make habitable, and that this is a really exciting example of that, I think.
And to segue into my honorable mention, when we're talking about adjusting the environment to ourselves, we really have to understand and use the principle that nature, to be commanded, must be obeyed. And that means that we have to fully understand how the world works, the natural world works, before we can turn it to our advantage and make it work the way we want it to. They had to understand how clouds formed and how rain formed in order to figure out that, if we zap lightning into the air, we can cause it. And so the next honorable mention that I wanted to talk about is more about the understanding part of it, understanding how our world developed, and it has to do with the dinosaurs. So
I love dinosaurs. I was a massive prehistory nut when I was younger.
So you can keep me on track here.
Yes.
So most of us know, to some degree anyway, that the dinosaurs that were essentially wiped out finally. You know, they went through some extinction events before this, but the big event was an asteroid or a comet, they're not sure which, that hit what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico.
Yeah.
They found the crater. This definitely happened. But it wasn't the asteroid directly that killed most of them.
Well, I'm sorry, that's a good example of, okay, a bunch of life went missing. What are some theories
happened?
for that? And then, maybe it was an asteroid impact. Let's go looking for a crater. Oh, here's one. So, that's a good example of theories at work.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it wasn't the asteroid directly. It was that the asteroid caused vulcanization and caused...
No,
I'm sorry.
So this actually ties into another piece of research that we found looking for a previous episode but didn't use at the time, which is that... So it's long been known, well, for a number of decades at least, that a few different factors came together to cause that extinction event. This happens at various points in the geological history. You get huge extinction events, like the one at the beginning of the Triassic, and then this one at the end of the Cretaceous, where generally that indicates that a number of different factors came along at the same time and caused a mass extinction. Whereas between those you get smaller extinctions that are probably just caused by one thing. And twice during the dinosaur period, at the end of the Jurassic the end of the Triassic and the end of the Jurassic, these smaller extinction events happened that sort of knocked the dinosaurs back but didn't kill them entirely and just took out a lot of species. Now it's looking like prior to the asteroid impact, a couple million years before that, this was already starting to happen again. There was a huge increase in volcanism and a lot of volcanic activity that was changing the climate.
Right.
So that was probably pushing them towards another of these blip and start again ones.
Right.
But then the asteroid came along and threw the whole thing off.
Right, and essentially threw up enough dust and stuff that it blocked out the sun, so the plants died, and then the herbivores didn't have food, and so all that really survived were the small ones.
You topple the entire food chain, and it's a nuclear
Eventually.
winter. It's nighttime for thousands
Not
of years.
literally, but basically. But they
It
also...
basically is literally an explosion of that size. Effectively, is a many atomic bombs going off at once situation.
But they also theorized for a long time that the asteroid that hit would have caused a tsunami in the area.
Yeah.
But they didn't have any proof until very recently.
It's actually a global tsunami, so it's a shockwave that would have gone around the entire ocean system.
Started in the Gulf of Mexico. And so what they did find recently was fossilized megaripples, they're called, where recorded in the sediment you see evidence of waves that were 16 meters or 52 feet tall. And these were found at a depth of about 1,500 meters or almost 5,000 feet. And so why do these numbers matter? Because we have to be really careful when we're trying to find evidence to fit a theory. You don't want to make the mistake of fitting puzzle pieces in where they don't belong, right? But with these giant waves found at that depth, it's quite clear there was a tsunami. A, you don't get waves that big without one. And B, that it was at the right time period to have been where that was. So just a quick word about who figured this out and how. The researchers were a team at the University of Louisiana Lafayette, led by Gary Kinsland. But they got the seismic data from a private company called Devon Energy. And it's very common for energy companies to obtain seismic data if they're looking for oil or natural gas, that sort of thing. They want to get an idea of where it might be before they start drilling, etc. And to be very purposeful and specific when they're doing that. So in this case, Devon Energy found the seismic data. I don't know if they realized what it might have been, but they turned it over to the University of Louisiana, I don't think it was by force. They offered it to them. And Kinsland and his team actually took several years sorting through all the data they were given and recently published this finding that there was in fact a tsunami that we would expect that hit. This particular seismic data came from what is now Louisiana. So in that particular area.
Yeah, so for those who don't realise, like a lot of what's now land was once underwater and vice versa.
Right.
So okay, I wanted to talk about a project by researchers at Aalto University in Finland, who are developing a wireless charger for multiple devices to charge at the same time. So this is a helpful thing for people like us who we're kind of travelling at the moment, and we have 2 laptops and 3 mobile phones between us. And a Kindle. And charging all of that at the same time with cables is
and adapters
not
for different countries.
And that, not to mention, so I was going to say, yes, so you want a whole bunch of devices, shavers, whatever, and also wireless chargers do exist now. they're still a relatively new development, but they have been around for a little while. But they do require, they can only charge one device at a time, and they require that device to stay in the same place because they establish a link with transmitters and sensors with the device so they know where to send the electromagnetic field. This device uses two electromagnetic fields kind of polarized opposite to each other to continuously send out, is there something there signals. It tries to establish connections. It doesn't just charge. It's not like firing radiation out in all directions.
That would be concerning.
No, it's just sending out constant signals trying to find something, and then anything you put within that field is going to lock onto and start charging.
Sure.
But it can do several different objects at the same time. Now, perhaps understandably, as we said with the one of the other things we discussed earlier, people have
concerns,
safety concerns with these things. This works. They've tested this thing. Now it's being put through the safety trials process.
So it's not on the market yet.
No, and it won't be until they're confident it's not going to. Because can you imagine if they release this product and then 5 years later it's like, oh, everyone's dying or catching cancer or whatever? How just damaging that would
really
be.
Bad.
So it's not in anybody's interest for that to happen. So if for those who buy into 5G conspiracies and mobile phones give you cancer and things like that, all of these things go through rigorous processes to make sure exactly that doesn't happen, because I don't think any company wants to be at the center of a huge scandal
or to cause that kind of pain. And I think people just don't want to hurt other people generally.
But also it's just not in anyone's interest for that to happen.
It's not good business practice to kill your customers.
But this is a good example of this is now big. So you probably won't see this on the market for a number of years yet, because it will go through a safety process, and then there's usually the process of figuring out mass manufacturing and making it cost effective and all that kind of thing as well.
But it's an exciting possibility.
It is very much so, yes.
Okay. So finally, I wanted to wrap up by talking about organic fertilizer made from cyanobacteria, which is a really creative solution to a particular problem. So let me outline what the problem is first. Some of you guys might be aware that soil degradation is a problem, and what that means specifically is that farmers are having to use land more intensively because we have that growing population. Particular countries may not be growing in population-wise, but worldwide the population is still growing, and use for land to be used for agriculture is decreasing. So farmers are having to use less land to grow more food, which means that you use the soil more intensively, that you can't let fields lie fallow for as long. And the result is that you get what's called soil degradation, wherein soils don't have as much organic matter, which matters for taking care of plants because they don't have as many nutrients, they can't hold water as well, etc. And you can help some of that with chemical means. There's a professor at Clemson, Dara Park, who's been doing some work on surfactants to improve water retention. You can use chemical fertilizers, are well known, for example, but those are limited and you have to be careful. Chemical fertilizers, if you use too much, they run off and they cause environmental problems. I don't think they're not really toxic, but
some of them can be harmful to the crop you're intending, or some methods of doing.
Only you'd have to be really bad. You'd have to be really bad at using chemical fertilizers to cause problems. It's possible. Over-application is a problem, but it's a pretty rare problem. In terms of directly, you can cause toxicity by giving the plant too much of a particular nutrient, but it's pretty difficult.
I think what we've learned here is that you know a lot more than I do about agriculture, and I know a lot more than you do about dinosaurs.
Anyway, so the solution many people are turning to fix the soil degradation and lack of nutrients problems is organic fertilizer. But there are some problems with organic fertilizer. It would make sense intuitively, let's add organic material back into the soil. But the organic fertilizers we have on the market so far tend to be pretty poor in nitrogen, which is the biggest nutrient plants need to grow.
It's basically horse poo, isn't it, organic fertilizer?
That's one form. Blood and bone meal is another, the seaweed is another. There are different algae. There are different sources of fertilizers, organic fertilizers, but almost all of them are relatively poor in nitrogen and other nutrients compared to chemical fertilizers, and they're also quite costly compared to chemical fertilizers. So some researchers from Flinders University in Australia, they've now been joined by researchers from the US and the UK, but this started in Australia.
All the best countries.
Started in Australia. they're using a genus of cyanobacteria called Polypothrix. So a word about cyanobacteria, because they're really cool. These were thought to be the first organisms to evolve the ability to photosynthesize. And they were eventually, not all of them obviously, but some of them were eventually subsumed by larger organisms, which evolved into algae, which evolved into plants. So these are essentially the evolutionary ancestors of plants. Yeah. But they still exist today. They still photosynthesize today. And there are different varieties. The particular variety that these researchers have been using are a freshwater variety, but they can handle some saline solution, some pollution as well. And so what the researchers are doing is just growing these cyanobacteria essentially in a pond, and harvesting it, letting it dry out, and powdering it, and then you have your fertilizer, which you can, of course, mix with your irrigation water like you could any powdered fertilizer. Yeah. But it has some advantages over, for example, growing algae in the same way. The big advantage is that algae needs nitrogen. So we were talking before about runoff fertilizer. One of the problems it can cause is algal blooms, which is where you've got excess nitrogen in a body of water combined with sunlight, and you'll get a bunch of algae that can actually kill fish and things. It's a huge problem. But the Polypothrix actually are nitrogen-fixing bacteria, which means that they can take the nitrogen in our atmosphere is like 78% nitrogen, and convert that into the form that plants can use. So you don't have to give them any nitrogen. They'll just take what's in the air.
Yeah, okay.
Huge advantage, both in terms of cost and difficulty and environmental problems. That was 3 things. But the other advantage to this particular genus is they're what's called self-flocculating, which means that they group themselves together. That's
just a rude-sounding word. But, yeah.
but it doesn't mean anything rude. It just means that they group themselves together, which makes it easy and cheap to harvest them.
Cool.
So the result is that you have a relatively cheap form of making organic fertilizers. In theory, a large farmer could do it themselves on their own land in like a pond, and grow these cyanobacteria, harvest it, dry it out, and you have your fertilizer.
Awesome.
So again, going back to the ramifications here, if you have a cheap, easy-to-produce fertilizer that's going to really restore your soils, rejuvenate your soils, makes it easier to use land more intensively in the way we need to feed more people. So,
fantastic, yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
So, to sum up quickly, the 2 main topics we talked about, I discussed the supposed proof, which is really corroborating evidence for the theory of general relativity, and you talked about defeating aging with parabiosis. Am I saying that?
That's right. And for our honorable mentions, we talked about the government in Dubai essentially making it rain, the tsunami that affected the dinosaurs, a device that can wirelessly charge multiple devices at the same time, and I finished this up by talking about organic fertilizer made from cyanobacteria. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.